Ok, hola. Voy a hablar con ustedes sobre comprehensible input. So today we're going to review and talk a little bit about what is comprehensible input. This is a special segment on comprehensible input and how it is used in the classroom and how we could potentially use it at Laurel Springs School. So the mission statement at Laurel Springs School is to engage global learners in an education that values them as individuals, integrates their passions and pursuits into academic and career pathways, and fosters inquiry, growth, mastery, purpose, and independence. So here's what we're going to talk about today. What is comprehensible input? In the world of language learning, this is a big buzzword. And so it's an opportunity to talk about, a lot of people kind of use this connected to standards-based grading and proficiency versus performance. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what is CI or comprehensible input, what is the role of the teacher, where does this come from? We're going to connect it to ACTFL, the American Council of Teachers of Foreign Language, and which is also a lot of the state standards in the United States. For high schools and so on, use ACTFL as their standards measurement. So we're going to look at some of the models. This is like an introductory level of comprehensible input. And as a teacher, how might I apply this? So here's a quote that I think is apt in this context. It says this: by replacing fear of the unknown with curiosity, we open ourselves up to an infinite stream of possibility. We can let fear rule our lives, or we can become childlike with curiosity, pushing our boundaries, leaping out of our comfort zones, and accepting what life puts before us. So Alan Watts, very famous author, philosopher, says this, and I think it's related to comprehensible input in regards to, we might have to get outside of our comfort zone, right? You're kind of in the middle, you're super comfortable in the middle donut, let's say, of the comfort zone idea. And then you're pushing out a little bit to say, oh, okay, I have been a certain type of teacher or educator for a long time. And how am I pushing that outward so that my circle is getting bigger? And maybe you don't want to get outside of the third ring, this idea of having 3 rings of a comfort zone, where it's like in the danger zone, really, right? So I don't really want to get into this too much, but I do think it's kind of an apt thing. So if you have this comfort zone, you're in the middle, and this is you. So let's say you're going to be the X, for example, and you're in there and you're like, this is awesome. This is great. No problems, right? What's the big deal? And then this zone is like, you're pushing outwards a little bit, for example, and you're expanding your ideas, right? So you're in the growth zone, for example. So that would be kind of in the growth area. And then the danger zone, you're not quite in the danger zone here, but if you continue, let me make my circle a little, oops, hang on, a little more better circle. Just bear with me for a moment. And so if we have another circle, let's say we say, all right, fine, that circle here is, now we're moving on beyond that comfort and we're really pushing the boundaries. But if we go way out here, we're in the danger zone. So we want to be, as educators, we want to kind of be in that growth zone, maybe a little on that fringe of that third idea, but going over here would definitely push us too far and say, you know what, are we really, es un poco peligroso, right? Or dangerous in Espanol, and so on. So the idea here is to expand our skills, reach beyond, extend, but maybe also keep it in perspective. So that's where the growth zone kind of comes into play. So there's a little quick overview on the Alan Watts's construct or quote here related to us as educators and whether we're not staying in that safe zone, right, versus kind of pushing ourselves into that growth area. All right, so let's move along. So here's some resources. We're going to talk a little bit about Stephen Krashen. We're going to talk in Vygotsky, and but we're going to connect with a few other teachers out there in the world who are working on comprehensible input. Joseph Cabral does this. Senor Diego Ojeda, Clet World Languages does this. Actful certainly ties into this. There's a place called the World of Learning. It's out of Pennsylvania. They do this. And there's other places too. There's tons of places, tons of resources on this. And so what I've tried to do is to compile some of this. So please feel free to use some of those to expand and use the research that that's out there. So what is comprehensible input? It's an instructional technique in which teachers provide input that allows students to understand most, but not necessarily all of the language. So again, we want them to feel like they have some context, have some understanding, but they're pushing out of that comfort zone just slightly to say, well, I didn't get all of that. Just when I read Shakespeare, right? I have been a Shakespeare fan a long time, and I have a bachelor's degree in English, and I still don't know all the words, but I still would read it. And I'm going to try to reach out and say, I understand that word, even though we don't even use that word on a day-to-day basis, perhaps. So we're going to reach beyond that and encourage our students to do that. Vygotsky, zone of proximal development, right? We want to be connected to them, but we also think of the comfort zone idea, right? Proximal development, like we're safe, we're good, we have a net to catch us, and so on. But we also want to expand ourselves. And Stephen Krashen's idea of inputs, this is a big, pedagogical theory of how to learn language. So we're teaching in the language, in the L2, second language, but within the reach of the student's range and a little bit higher. So that's the I+1 that Stephen Krashen talks about. So some people call it the natural approach, and so on. I don't want to get into all this, but there's lots of approaches and ways through this little comprehensible input umbrella can dive into that. So Krashen says this: language is best taught when it is being used to transmit messages, not when it is explicitly taught for conscious learning. So let's talk about what that means, transmit messages. So here's him. I got this from Joseph Cabral, but these are out there on the World Wide Web or wherever. So again, here's a little back to the, comfort zone situation. Current level of language proficiency, like they know how to say some basic things in your second language, right? They know how to say in Spanish tortilla, and they're like, I know tortilla, I know taco, and like, great, let's now talk about what's in that tortilla, carne asada or aguacate, or you might even expand out and say, hay pepinos or pepinillos or whatever, and they're like, I don't know what pepinos are, as opposed to a chile, and you're like, okay, great, do you want to put some cucumbers? So they might not know that. So comprehensible input is saying, great, you know some things. What do you know? Let's expand on that and let's add more. It's not putting it into like, let's talk about all the crazy stuff that you might put in there in Puerto Rico or something like that. That's completely out of their scope of learning, but we're going to do the I+1, input plus a little bit more, as opposed to I+2. So make it, and make it compelling. I think that's an important thing to talk about. So make it interesting, make it even better than interesting, compelling. Like, do they want to talk about tacos? Do they want to talk about food from Puerto Rico or whatever the thing is? Because if they find it boring, the student, in this case, the learner, then it's not going to appeal to them. And why would they learn that thing? You might say, well, this is a way for them to learn basic language, but trying to make that interesting at a minimum and even better compelling is going to, hook that student and that learner into our learning world. So Krashen continues on. He says, we acquire spoken fluency not by practicing talking, but by understanding input, by listening, by reading. So speaking a foreign language, a second language, a third language, and so forth, is a very tall task, as we all know. So by listening, by reading, by having that input, he's all about the input, and elevating it a little bit more So making it accessible to that student with that proximal zone of development, that's what we're really kind of getting into. So offer appropriate and compelling listening and reading exercises slightly above their level, increase vocabulary acquisition through reading, through context, versus simply learning words to learn a word, right? So if I think of the movie Rain Man, if you've ever seen that, with Dustin Hoffman way back when, and I think Tom Cruise, and they go across the country, right? And then Rain Man, which is Dustin Hoffman, keeps pointing out signs and he just reads them in a random way. And they have no meaning and no context. And Tom Cruise gets all kind of annoyed at him, right? Because he's got a little bit of some, something going on, so that he has to say this thing, feels compelled. So the point is don't just say words to say words. Say words because they are meaningful to people. So, how can we do that? We can talk about various themes. We do this already. So just keeping it in that zone of like, it's important to someone so that when they have, to lock the house, they know how to say the word key and how to say the word to shut, to open, and so forth, like that. Another couple of authors that tap into Krashen's models and ideas and are more current are Dr. Florencia Henshaw and Maris Hawkins. I got this from Stephen Cabral. So they say this: the acquisition of language is the mostly implicit process of building a linguistic system by making form-meaning connections from the input. It's what happens subconsciously while we're busy understanding messages, a process that we can't consciously control. So what does that mean? So these two authors of this book called Common Ground are saying that how can I form meaning and connections with that meaning of those words in the present tense or something, but not just know that it's in the present tense verb or something, but how can I put it in a context so that it really sticks with me and is something that my brain can make a connection with. So it's a relationship building construct versus just learning words to learn words. There are those people in the world who want to learn words just to learn words, but a lot of people really need to find a connection to the word, a relationship with that word, so that they make meaning of it. Or how can I use it in a sentence? So the comprehensible input idea is to say, how can I use this in a sentence? And then the acquisition is happening through the process of reading, getting input. It's showing the learning versus just simply saying, oh, I recognize that's a verb versus a noun versus whatever, right? It's done through an uncontrolled process, and it's finding a way so that we can say, oh, cool, I understood what that meant. Well, did you understand all the words? No, it's like Shakespeare. I don't understand every single word, but I get the gist of it. And then eventually, when we have enough of that CI, that input, comprehensible input, then we start diving in more and more to some of the details so we can feel more and more confident. And we're kind of hooked in. We want to be able to talk to, whoever it is that's a Spanish speaker or a French or German speaker. So ACTFL, the American Council of Teachers of Foreign Languages, is what that stands for, has proficiency levels. Most of our states, not all, but many, many, many states, even the state I live in, which is Arizona mostly, and the state that I often live in, called Oregon, use this. So, and I'm pretty sure Pennsylvania uses this. Anyway, the point is lots of places use this as a model. So there's different levels. There's the novice level, as you can see in here. There's here's our novice, and there's categories. There's our intermediate, there's our advanced, there's our superior, there's our distinguished. So there's categories of this. So we're going to kind of talk about what's going on with ACTFL and what is it they're trying to achieve by having this. And basically, my sort of basic overview on this is that they're trying to say it's not just about word recognition or conjugation of verbs and so on. It's about, can I actually be proficient versus perform? Performing is putting something on a piece of paper, and can you put a word in the bubble or something like that, right? And so that's more of a performance, or did I actually do the worksheet, right? As a language teacher for many, many years in person, students are all about, how many points did I get? I did something, and I'm like, thank you. But did it mean anything? Are they a little bit more proficient? Can they use the skills in even a novice low way? But ideally, I mean, that's the starting point. So within the construct of ACTFL, there are these three modes. There's the interpersonal, there's the interpretive, and then there's the presentational. So we're going to talk a little bit about that now. So an element of the interpretive mode, I would say this is mode number 1. So this is like literal comprehension. We say something, we start as teachers, we start saying words, we ask them what they know, we build on what they know, we ask them what their interests are, we build on that, and then we give them something like this dozen eggs, or whatever this is, 6 eggs, half a dozen eggs, and we say, what are words that you do recognize, cognates, and so on, right? So we start really basic and on a very low level of language learning, but then there are some words that we might say, well, what do you think some of these words mean? So we're trying to help them to infer meaning. The keyword recognition is more like cognates and so on. Detail detection, like maybe through the context of seeing this thing, they understand more by having an image. So we look at that context, and then we also, if it's a reading, look at the author's perspective. You know, if it's something about sports and they see the word in Espanol, deportes, there's a lot of connection between deportes and sports. Like that word, if you break it up a little bit as a word person, you might say, oh, the letters of sports is kind of in deportes, and so on. So the point is to try to get into the author's perspective. Like, what are they trying to say? Are they upset? Are there any images that can help me? Are there exclamation points? So how is this getting the message across without giving a direct translation word for word? That's the part of the interpretive mode. So again, it's input. If learners are not understanding, then they cannot make form-meaning connections. They are not building a linguistic system that they can use for communicative purposes. We want to communicate. That's our overall goal. So if they're like, I don't know any words here, this makes no sense to me, right? Like gros, or I'm not a French, so I'm not going to be able to say this correctly, but I can still start to make out some of those words, even though I'm not a French speaker, by the context of this image. So we're going to go with that as educators and say, what do you know? Let's celebrate what you know, and let's add on a little bit more. Let's give a vocab list. So there is some literal comprehension learning that way, but it's after we've hooked them and said, you know some things, right? You know, the word tortilla is tortilla. It's not anything else but a tortilla. It's not like we call it flat bread that doesn't rise. We call it a tortilla. So some words get stolen from different languages. So we build on that, and we try to encourage them to have some level of success that way. So again, how do we help students who know nothing in the L2, in the second language? We introduce them to the text prior to we introduce vocabulary prior to the authentic text shown. Video, sometimes images are going to really be our friend here. Cartoons and memes to help understand that, like commercials are great because they're repetitive. We scaffold and we keep working on that, and that we encourage them to take a calculated risk that feels like it's okay to jump out of that comfort zone just slightly. So lowering the affective filter, trying to help them say, oh yeah, it's okay to make mistakes. It's normal, it's natural, it's expected, versus saying, you didn't know it. So let's, you're not ready for Spanish. You're not ready for French. You're not ready for German. So I took this from Joseph Cabral again. So understanding meaning through reading. So reading is a big thing, because in some languages, reading is sort of our gateway, because we do read already in one language. Most of our students can do this. And so we work on words and phrases first, then we start chunking, and then we have maybe small, short sentences. Then we connect those words, right? We make complicated sentences. We have two verbs next to each other, and we talk about that. So we have discrete individual sentences, and then that would be the intermediate phase. And then advanced, again, this is back to ACTful, is encouraging to write full-on paragraphs using that vocabulary. So after it's part of the interpretive mode, still an interpretive, is the appropriate this is what ACTful says. It's the appropriate interpretation of meanings, including cultural, that occur in written and spoken form, read, heard, viewed, when there is no recourse to the active negotiation of meaning with the writer or the speaker. So it's taking information, it's listening to it, it's reading it, it's trying to gather information when we don't necessarily have other context, but we want to give them as much context as possible, but because the goal is to figure out, how can I learn, how can I use what I know already, build on that. So we look at the authentic resource and begin to comprehend. The goal is to first to read and so on, and to take it in, soak it in. Production comes later in terms of speaking, let's say. All right, second mode, interpersonal. The interpersonal, according to ACTful, is the active negotiation of meaning amongst individuals. Participants observe and monitor one another to see how their intentions and meanings are being communicated. Adjustments and clarifications can be made accordingly. Participants need to initiate, maintain, and at some level sustain the conversation. Again, this is like low, medium, high in the construct of, are you a novice? Are you an intermediate? Are you an advanced? Are you a superior? And so on. So you can, as a teacher, apply different levels so that you can encourage your students to say, well, this is too boring for me. And I'm like, great, let's step it up a little bit for you because you know some more things. Awesome. So you're going to respond in kind to that. So this looks like dialoguing back and forth, questioning, answering, learning something from the speaker, and as a responder, working with that and going back and forth like that. So exchanging information. So learners are processing what they've learned. They have to interact, they pause, they consider the ideas of the other, they respond. And if the person responds in a confusing way, then they're going to say, that doesn't make sense. Why did you say that? So again, we pause and we redirect, we rephrase. All those things help us say we're getting better and better with the language. So here's an example. So let's say you would do the food thing that we just talked about with eggs, for example, and you're going to make some kind of food with the eggs. So perhaps students have an interaction of, they go to the supermarket, they go to the farmer's market, they're given a certain amount of money. They have to only speak in the L2, and they have to find some ingredients, nutrient-rich ingredients, or they look up this recipe, right? They don't have to actually physically buy that thing. They could do this interactively as well. And then they have a receta in Espanol, like a recipe. They find the foods, they decipher some of those words, they look at the images and help them out. So this is, again, all in that, we're talking about the interpretive plus the interpersonal. It's a back and forth. Like, do you think this is, tú necesitas, I don't know, tortillas con los huevos or whatever, right? And so on. So they go into that, tú necesitas cebollas, and so on. And you're like, oh, there's a cebolla right there. Aceite de oliva. And you might say, oh yeah, I know what that means. Look at the images. Back to Joseph Cabral. So here's a little graphic organizer to help understand the interpretive and interpersonal levels. So again, we're trying to get them to work with single paragraph, single ideas, chunking them together, a list, chunking, then having single sentences, discrete sentences, single short paragraphs, strings of sentences, and then connecting all of those to make more complicated things, and then making it all connect, right? So we go from novice, isolated words, intermediate, discrete sentences, advanced, connecting it all, making the sentences into solid, comprehensible paragraphs, spoken and written. Usually written comes before spoken. Presentational is the third mode in actful. So the interpretive burst gathers ideas, interpersonal interacts with each other, negotiates, processes. The third one is presentational. This is the demonstration mode. Here's what actful says. It's the creation of oral and written messages in a manner that facilitates interpretation by an audience of listeners, readers, or viewers, where there's no direct opportunity for this active negotiation of meaning to exist. So this is more like a one-way thing. This is what I'm doing right now. I'm giving you information. It's a one-way deal, and I could have you participate, but I am delivering. I am presenting, presentational. That's what presentational is. So the role of the presenter is to present, demonstrate, show, share. The audience is there. Hopefully they're in the L2 right there. They're with you on that. They're listening, they're interpreting, perhaps they're asking questions. So there could be some negotiation going on. So ways that we do this, like with the food situation with the eggs, the recipe, and then we actually show this is what I created. So, or it could be a written form. It could be a combination of written, spoken. There could be songs, drama plays. It could be an email situation. Lots of ways to show our, to demonstrate the learning of this. That's presentational mode. So actful can-do statements, proficiency benchmarks. So again, in this context, actful says that I can identify the general topics and basic information in both very familiar and everyday context by recognizing practice or memorized words, phrases, simple sentences in text that are written, spoken, or signed. Intermediate expands, right? That's the safety mode is novice. So then we're going to reach out and say, okay, fine, let's even have a few words in the intermediate zone. So I can understand the main idea and some pieces of information on familiar topics from sentences and series of connected words within texts, authentic texts that are spoken, written, or signed. Finally, advanced is reaching even beyond, but it depends on where the student starts. So what does a novice mean for a student who is a native speaker is very different than what for a student who, or a learner who really knows only a few words, you know? So anyway, so the advanced says, I can understand the main message and supporting details on a wide variety of familiar and general interest topics across various timeframes, from complex organized texts that are written, spoken, signed. Proficiency takeaway. So I listened to another learning video. I was a part of this little group that listened to some authors from the CLEP World Languages group, and they identified these. I thought these were interesting and important to consider. So every time you use an authentic text, consider its proficiency level. So for example, that egg carton, right? Is that novice? Is that intermediate? Well, it depends. I mean, what am I going for here? So if I want to make it an intermediate level, then I would maybe add more questions like how much did it, where would I have gotten something like this? It doesn't say anything about that, but we can make some assumptions here and say, oh, did you go to the farmer? Did you go to the farmer's market? Did you go to the supermarket? And, you know, so you can advance that skill. Next one, it says, ensure that you are not expecting your students to function above their proficiency level. This can lead to frustrations for the students and you. So again, keeping them in that middle zone, but reaching, right? It's pulsing like that. And finally, hopefully that pulsing is like going to help them say, oh yeah, I'm really actually in that middle zone. Frequently refreshing your understandings of actful proficiency guides. So as an educator, really making sure that I'm not expecting too much. I'm expecting enough though. But I'm also helping them to realize that what they do know is important to them. And is it compelling? Is it compelling curriculum versus is it boring? And is it something that they can keep recycling? All right. So, and last but not least in this context, if a text is above their level, what can you do to make it more accessible to your students? So that would be a great question for us to talk about. And so one of the things to potentially make it more accessible to our students is above their level, have more images perhaps, or put some context in it, like have a meme around it. I don't know, but there's lots of options right there. Okay, so again, all right, here's a fun little thing. So as an in-person teacher forever, I can totally relate to this right here. And as online teachers, we can relate to this too, because we have to assess their grade. We have to assess their skill level. So a lot of us are still in the A, B, C, D, F sort of mindset here. And so some schools have not moved into this thing called standards-based grading. So in that construct, then we're going to try to go from a performance to a proficiency level grading idea. So we need to review and rethink a rubric. So a lot of times, if you look at rubrics, again, that's a whole different discussion, but it'll go on a scale of 1 to 4, 4 being high. So if it's expansion, then it's a 4, right? If it's meeting, it's a 3. If it's approaching, you're almost there, you're on the way there, that's a 2. If it's not yet there, like maybe you're just making a couple of words, a couple of lists and so on, then it's a 1. If you haven't even tried, then that's a 0, you know? So a lot of schools, including ours, maybe needs to consider, like, how would we help the student translate a 4 is really what we're going for. It's a little bit of a gray zone. Exactly what does a 4 mean? Because we can have a rubric, and without rubrics, we're a little bit lost. So we need something to help guide us to keep us all on track that way. So this is just one way to say a 4, it takes more time to do this, but a 4 is like a 3.5 to a 4. Sorry, an A is a 3.5 to a 4, and so on. So if a student gets this, they're more like a B, right, in the B plus category. So they're more like in the 3 category. So what does a B look like? It looks like they are, so they're in the 3 to 3.24 category of the proficiency level, but some school districts or so on want to have a letter, A, B, C, D, F. And so we can accommodate that, but it will take some time and some adjustment. So that we can make sure that the student, it's a different mindset, it's a shift. So in the role of CI, of comprehensible input, what is the role of the language teacher here? How do they help? So again, this is a little bit of a review, but finding authentic text, music, making it appropriate level plus a little higher, make it compelling, expanding and extending their ideas, not getting so stuck on, did they say the right verb in every single sentence in that 11 sentence paragraph, right? But challenging them to say, you do know a lot, right? There are some things to work on, but let's not focus only on the one thing you didn't know, but let's look at what you did. So it's changing the mindset. So the goal is on proficiency, showing what they can do, what they can produce, and are they getting their meaning across to the audience? To gain levels of proficiency, I'm repeating a little bit, what can a student do? Versus what do you know about the language? Okay, I knew that those were verbs. I knew that they were conjugated. Those are good things to know, right? But that's not necessarily going to hook them initially. So we have this idea that a lot of students or a lot of adults have this idea that, oh, I'm just not good at languages, right? I have friends who say that I'm just not good. You know, it's not my thing. I'm not going to try. So we have to shift and say, how can I help someone look at something like that dozen eggs and say, you do know some words, even if you've never spoken French before, right? So everyone can learn a language. We've learned this language called English, very challenging in the world of language and the context of lots of languages, according to many, many people. So if we can do that, then we can produce in other languages as well. So key elements of language acquisition, lots of input. We want to acquire those ideas in a contextual situation, make it compelling, make it interesting, repeat, right? You keep recycling those words, lower the affective filter so that it makes it approachable for students so that they don't feel like they're it's not a punitive situation, and give it context, relate it, make it interesting because they're interested in that subject. If they want to eat food, they're going to be interested in breakfast foods. Great. Let's talk about that. All right. So this is the end of this. So there's a lot more to say. However, all of this, ¿cómo le gustaría que fuera su clase? All right. So Diego Ojeda is another person that I listen to off and on, go to his workshops online and this and that. And he works off and on with CLET languages as well. So the idea is that we don't all learn or perceive in the same way. So we want to use comprehensible input as a way to help us recognize that learning and showing that learning can sometimes look really different. Like for me, maybe it is making that omelet. Maybe for somebody else, it's like, they're like, look, I can't wait to write my own recipe because I have a better omelet than this recipe has. Okay, great. So that person's going to write a news recipe. I'm going to show you the learning through actually producing an omelet because I read this directly. Maybe I'm very, very like specific, right? I want to follow a recipe to the T. So we would do well to find flexible and open-minded ways so that students can show their learning and demonstrate their learning in more than one way. Comprehensible input and individualized assessment plans, which is kind of what I just went through with going from the interpretive to the interpersonal to the presentational. We can have that kind of a project and offer options. So it's the mindset of if I was a learner in this class, ¿cómo le gustaría que fuera su clase? How would you like it if this was your class? If I was the learner in this class, how would I want to learn? So we have to keep that mindset as educators in the forefront of our brains. So what are kind of options that I would like that can help drive our discussion? So como dijo Caleb Gateño, el aprendizaje corre cuando las mentes de los estudiantes estén en modo de descubrimiento. So this says the learning occurs when the minds of the students are in the mindset of discovery. So I think that's the heart and soul of comprehensible input, is we want to have that wonder discovery thing alive and well, and not be in sort of squashed away or put over there because we fill them up with stuff that's too challenging. We want to tone it down, make it challenging, but not overkill even. I hope this was helpful. So this is an overview on comprehensible input. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk about this topic. Thank you.